Christmas Eve has always been my favorite night of the year. There's something magical about it. The warm glow of lights, the crisp cold air, and the promise of happiness just hours away. But this Christmas Eve was different, one that I can't forget no matter how much I try. I had just moved to a small apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood a few months prior. The streets were lined with identical houses and snow-covered driveways, and the neighborhood was known for being peaceful, even boring. As a single 29-year-old, I wasn't too concerned about making friends with my neighbors. My work kept me busy, and I liked the solitude of the holidays. That night, the snow fell softly outside, blanketing the streets in white. Inside, my tiny apartment was cozy. The fireplace crackled with warmth, Christmas lights cast a golden glow over the living room, and the soft hum of holiday carols played from a speaker. I was in the middle of wrapping the last of the presents for my family. They were all back in my hometown, and I planned to visit them early Christmas morning. It was around 10:30 p.m. when the first knock came. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the door. I ignored it and focused on cutting the wrapping paper just right. Then the knock came again, louder this time. It was distinct, deliberate. Someone was at the door. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting anyone, and most of the neighbors had left town for the holidays. Still, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a delivery driver or someone lost in the snow. I got up, pulling my robe tightly around me, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw him. A man stood there, his back to the door. He was dressed in a tattered Santa suit. The red velvet was faded and frayed, and the white trim was stained a dingy gray. Snow clung to his shoulders, and his Santa hat was askew, covering part of his face. Something about his posture unsettled me. He stood too still, too rigid, like a mannequin. "Hello?" I called through the door, not bothering to open it. The man didn't respond. Instead, he began humming a Christmas carol, low and slow. It was Silent Night, but his rendition was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The notes dragged out, uneven and haunting. My heart started to race. "Can I help you?" I tried again, louder this time. The man stopped humming abruptly, the silence stretching between us. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, he turned his head slightly toward the door. Through the peephole, I could only see the corner of his face, a pale cheek and a twisted smile. His lips were dry and cracked, and the smile didn't reach his eyes, which I couldn't fully see. I stepped back from the door, instinctively locking the deadbolt and chain. Something was deeply wrong. For the next hour, he didn't leave. He just stood there, humming that same twisted version of Silent Night, occasionally knocking on the door. Not pounding, but knocking, soft and deliberate, like he wanted me to open it of my own accord. I called the police, my hands trembling as I clutched the phone. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be there within 15 minutes, but those minutes felt like an eternity. I sat on the couch, gripping a kitchen knife, my eyes never leaving the door. The knocking stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sound. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. Slowly, I crept toward the door and looked through the peephole again. He was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside my living room window froze me in place. My apartment was on the ground floor, and the blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint shadow of someone moving just beyond them. "Where are the police?" I whispered to myself, gripping the knife tighter. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the window. Slowly, the shadow grew larger, as though whoever it was had stepped closer, pressing against the glass. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. Then came the tapping, a single, deliberate tap on the glass. I backed away, my legs shaking. I didn't dare open the blinds. Instead, I ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I huddled in the corner, dialing the police again. This time, the dispatcher sounded concerned. "We have an officer en route. Stay on the line." As she spoke, I heard it, the faint sound of humming. Silent night, slow and distorted, as though it were coming from inside the apartment. "No," I whispered. "He's outside." "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Help is almost there." But the humming grew louder. It was no longer coming from the window. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, tears streaming down my face as the sound grew closer. Then came the soft knock on my bedroom door. "Let me in," a voice whispered, low and guttural. The police arrived moments later, their lights flashing through the windows. I screamed for help, and within seconds, the officers burst into the apartment. They searched every room but found no one. The snow outside was undisturbed, with no footprints leading to or from the windows. I spent Christmas morning with my family, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I never stayed in that apartment again. To this day, I don't know who or what came to my door that night. But sometimes, when I hear Silent Night, I can still hear the faint, distorted humming in the back of my mind. The year 2020 was already strange enough, but for me, Christmas that year became a nightmare I could never forget. My grandmother had passed away in October, leaving my family devastated. She had always been the heart of our Christmas celebrations, with her traditions, her baking, and her uncanny knack for choosing the perfect gifts. That December, as a way to honor her memory, my family decided to gather at her old Victorian house, which she had left to my parents. The house was over a century old, filled with creaky floorboards, dimly lit corridors, and an attic that no one dared to venture into. Despite its age, the house had always been warm and inviting when my grandmother was alive. But without her, it felt different, empty, cold. I arrived 2 days before Christmas Eve, helping my parents and siblings decorate the house. My grandmother had kept all her decorations in the attic, so it fell to me to retrieve them. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the narrow staircase, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. The attic was exactly as I remembered, dusty, filled with cobwebs, and cluttered with decades of forgotten belongings. In the far corner, I spotted the familiar plastic bins labeled Christmas. Opening one, I found the usual ornaments, glass baubles, garlands, and strings of lights. But as I sifted through them, something unusual caught my eye. It was a single ornament I had never seen before, wrapped in old tissue paper. Carefully, I unwrapped it, revealing a delicate glass sphere with a miniature snow-covered village inside. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but what struck me most was how oddly familiar it felt. Bringing it downstairs, I asked my mom about it. "I've never seen that before," she said, frowning. "Maybe your grandmother bought it recently and forgot to use it." Something about her tone made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. We decided to hang the ornament front and center on the Christmas tree, thinking it was a fitting tribute to Grandma. That night, as we sat by the fireplace sipping hot cocoa, I found my eyes constantly drifting to the ornament. The tiny village inside seemed different somehow, When I first looked at it, there had been no lights in the houses, but now faint yellow glows emanated from the windows. I convinced myself it was just the reflection of the tree lights and went to bed. On Christmas Eve, things began to escalate. It started small. My sister Sarah mentioned hearing faint music during the night, as if someone was playing a music box. My dad brushed it off, saying the old house creaked and groaned all the time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ornament became the center of my unease. Whenever I passed by the tree, I felt compelled to stare at it. The village inside seemed to grow more detailed with each glance. New features appeared: a church steeple, a tiny frozen pond, even miniature people. By evening, my unease had turned to fear. As we gathered for dinner, I noticed the people inside the ornament weren't just generic figures. They looked familiar. One of them had my dad's posture and beard. Another resembled my sister, down to her curly hair and red sweater. I didn't say anything, not wanting to sound crazy. After dinner, I went to the living room alone to examine the ornament more closely. Picking it up, I realized the glass felt warm to the touch, almost like it was alive. The tiny figures inside seemed to move ever so slightly, as though frozen mid-step. "Stop it," I muttered to myself, placing the ornament back on the tree. That's when I heard it. A soft, high-pitched laugh. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from the ornament itself. I ran to get my mom and dad, dragging them back to the tree. But when they looked at the ornament, it appeared perfectly normal. No lights, no moving figures, no sound. My mom gave me a concerned look, suggesting I was just tired from all the preparations. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the furnace, the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. "Sarah?" I called out, thinking it was my sister. No response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it under the door. There was no shadow, no sign of anyone there, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, waiting for morning. Christmas morning should have been joyful, but the mood in the house was somber. My mom looked pale and tired, saying she'd had strange dreams about Grandma. My dad was uncharacteristically quiet, and Sarah wouldn't even go near the living room. When I asked her why, she just shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "The ornament," she whispered. "I saw it. It was watching me." Determined to put an end to the madness, I grabbed the ornament and took it outside. My plan was to smash it in the driveway, but as soon as I stepped into the cold air, a strange force seemed to grip me. The ornament felt like it weighed a ton, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't let go of it. The world around me blurred, and for a split second, I wasn't standing outside anymore. I was inside the village. The tiny snow-covered street stretched out before me, and I could hear faint whispers all around. Then, just as quickly, I was back on the driveway, gasping for air. I never told my family what happened, but I refused to let that ornament stay in the house. On December 26th, I drove out to a frozen lake, wrapped the ornament in a heavy cloth, and tossed it into the icy water. For a moment, I felt relief. But as I turned to leave, I swear I heard faint laughter echoing across the frozen landscape. To this day, I don't know where that ornament came from or what it really was. But every Christmas Eve, I find myself unable to sleep, haunted by the memory of that tiny, sinister village. In 2016, I was living in a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. Winters there were harsh, and Christmas was a quiet affair. People kept to themselves, and the streets were eerily silent after dark, blanketed in snow. It was my first Christmas alone after my recent breakup, and I decided to spend it in the cozy old cabin I'd inherited from my grandfather. The cabin was charming in its own way, rustic, with a roaring fireplace and a view of the surrounding forest. It was secluded, which I appreciated at the time. After months of city chaos, I needed the peace and quiet. Little did I know that the solitude would soon feel like a curse. The snowstorm began on December 22nd, trapping me inside the cabin. My plan for a quick trip to the local store was canceled as the roads became impassable. Luckily, I had enough supplies to last the week. I spent the first 2 days decorating the cabin, baking cookies, and streaming old Christmas movies. On Christmas Eve, the storm finally calmed, leaving behind a thick, glistening blanket of snow. I decided to take a short walk just to stretch my legs. The woods were breathtaking, the trees bending under the weight of the snow. But as I wandered, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a faint crunch of snow behind me, like footsteps. I'd stop and turn, but there was nothing, only the stillness of the forest. Convinced it was just an animal, I hurried back to the cabin. As night fell, I settled in by the fireplace with a cup of cocoa, trying to ignore my growing unease. That's when I heard it, faint singing. At first, I thought it was coming from my laptop, but the sound wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was outside. Curious, and admittedly a little freaked out, I opened the door. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing, were 4 figures. They were holding candles and dressed in what looked like Victorian-era clothing. Carolers? I muttered to myself, confused. Their singing was beautiful, hauntingly so. The melody was unfamiliar, the words a language I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, stepping onto the porch. "Can I help you?" They didn't respond. They just stood there, singing. I didn't know what to do. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and carolers were unheard of in this area. Besides, who would be out here in the freezing cold, in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that? After a few minutes, their song ended abruptly. They stood in silence, staring at me. "Can I offer you something? Hot chocolate?" I asked nervously. Without a word, they turned and disappeared into the woods. Shaken, I went back inside and locked the door. I told myself it was just a strange tradition I wasn't aware of, maybe a reenactment or a group from the town. But deep down, I knew something was off. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, their pale faces and unblinking eyes. Around midnight, I heard the singing again. This time, it was closer. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitantly peered out the window. The carolers were back, standing just a few feet from the cabin. Their faces were clearer now, illuminated by their flickering candles. Something was wrong. Their features looked distorted, as if their skin didn't fit quite right. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, but their eyes remained fixed on me. Panicking, I closed the curtains and turned off the lights, hoping they'd go away. But the singing continued, growing louder, more insistent. I tried to drown it out by turning on the TV, but the power suddenly went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the fire, which was starting to die down. The singing stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then came the knocking. It wasn't on the front door, it was on the windows, the walls, the roof. A rhythmic, deliberate pounding that echoed through the cabin. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking ceased, replaced by whispers. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like my name. Desperate, I grabbed the old hunting rifle my grandfather had kept in the cabin. I wasn't even sure if it was loaded, but it gave me a false sense of security. Slowly, I made my way to the front door. "Who's there?" I demanded. No answer. I yanked the door open, ready to face whatever was outside. But there was no one there, just the empty clearing, the snow undisturbed. Breathing heavily, I stepped onto the porch. The forest was silent, the air biting cold. Then, from behind me, I heard the faint sound of a music box. Spinning around, I saw one of the carolers standing in the doorway of the cabin. The candle in their hand burned impossibly bright, illuminating the hollow sockets where their eyes should have been. I screamed and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the woods, and when I looked again, the caroler was gone. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, clutching the rifle, the fire burning low. The singing didn't return, but I could feel them watching me. By morning, the power had come back, and the storm had cleared enough for me to drive into town. I told the local sheriff what had happened, but he dismissed it as a combination of isolation and stress. When I returned to the cabin later that day to pack my things, I found something on the porch, a single melted candle and an old crumpled piece of sheet music. The notes were written in a language I didn't recognize. I haven't been back to the cabin since. To this day, I can't hear Christmas carols without feeling a chill run down my spine. I often wonder who or what those carolers were, and why they chose me.